Hello, everyone. A very good morning to you. I'm glad that you were able to join today's lesson on Job, chapters 8 to 10. My name is Johnston, and I am the proud father of this little boy here. He's been having a really tough past couple of days with diarrhea and a terrible rash, so appreciate your prayers for him. So anyway, every time this precious boy annoys me, I like to joke with my wife about how I'll sell him away secretly for $2,000. Of course, that is a really poor joke, and I have enjoyed his companionship over the last 7.5 months, each day being more precious than the last. And if he were to ever disappear from my life, I know without a doubt that I would be in a world of pain. But that is probably nothing compared to the pain and anguish felt by Job, for he had 10 grown children whom he dearly loved. And one fine day, all of a sudden, he lost them all. Today, we will be continuing the study of the book of Job, and we're hitting chapters 8 to 10, as mentioned, where Job's second friend, Bildad, comes into the picture and he speaks for the first time, and Job responds to him. But before we begin, let us take a brief look at the journey of Job to this point. Job began the story as a faithful rich man. He was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He also happened to be very blessed with earthly riches. He had 10 children and a huge flock of animals. But God allowed Satan to test Job, and Job lost his property, his servants, his children, his health, his standing in the community, and the support of his own dear wife. His friends, beginning with Eliphaz, ended their week of respectful silence and proceeded to make long speeches, pulling apart Job's life and his beliefs, continually challenging him in his loss. In last week's lesson, Uncle Lehawk shared a lesson on the conversation between Eliphaz and Job, which was the first conversation between Job and one of his friends. Eliphaz was an eloquent speaker and seemed to be considerate of with his choice of words, and his main message was that if you sin, Job, you will suffer, and alluding to the fact that Job was suffering because he sinned. And as we continue on this series on Job, you will realize that Job's friends generally exercise the same thought process. God is just, and so he runs the world according to his justice. And if he runs the world according to justice and Job is suffering, it must be that he sinned and is being punished. So now we come to Bildad, the second friend to speak to Job, and we can learn 3 things from his speech. Firstly, we learn a little bit about Bildad as a person. He's a very straightforward guy, possibly impatient and confrontational. As soon as Job completes his reply to Eliphaz in chapter 7, he jumps in very strongly in verse 2. How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind, which is the poetic way of saying, look, Job, you're talking a lot of nonsense and you should just shut up right now. So Eliphaz also had told Job that his children had died because of his sins. Job obviously doesn't feel great hearing this. Not that he was feeling great to begin with, but Eliphaz is probably like, hey, what's the difference between 85% pain and 86% pain? Basically the same thing, right? So Bildad, slightly different. Maybe he's kind of the nice guy. He just reassures Job, hey, it wasn't your sin that caused their destruction. They died because of their own sin. So Job goes, phew, so it wasn't my sin that did them in. And he feels comforted, and we've come to the end of Job. Just kidding. This is the basis of Bildad's character right here. The friends have come a long way, They've waited a good week before having this conversation with Job, but the first things that come out of his mouth are full of aggression. There's no show of friendly sympathy, no attempt to soothe or comfort a man in suffering and agony. This is Bildad. He's tired of Job's constant attempt to claim innocence. He's probably the kind of guy that sees everything in binary. It's either 1 or 0, black or white, right or wrong. And he took no time at all to try to understand Job. He heard his words, but he did not try to consider Job's pain. So we come to the second part, which is about his viewpoints. Bildad tells Job, "Your children died because of their sins." He then urges Job to go to God in repentance of his own sins. As Bildad believed that Job's children died to their sin, he also believed that Job's suffering was a result of Job's sin. But if you will seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. He's basically saying that Job is not pure and upright, contrary to Job's claims, and contrary to what God recognized Job to be blameless and upright in chapter 1. And Bildad, thinking this way, he's frustrated with Job's insistence on his own innocence. He rebukes Job and urges Job to seek God earnestly and plead for forgiveness. In addition to that, he sees prosperity as being in direct correlation with obedience to God. Good boy equals rich boy. Suffering, central to his understanding of God, is that behavior on earth will directly cause specific results. Suffering on earth is the result of sin, your sin. Living the good life on earth is the result of being obedient to God or having righteousness. If you're good, life is good. If you're bad, life is bad. The third thing we can learn about Job, about Bildad, is that he has some hard evidence to back this viewpoint of his, and it makes him very certain about his beliefs. Remember Uncle Lee Hawk's lesson last week, where Eliphaz had visions of Eliphaz had visions and heard voices, and these were the sources which told him the things that he would say to Job. Bildad's source of information comes from the past. In verses 8 and 9 of chapter 7 and 8, he says, "Ask the former generation and find out what their ancestors learned, for we were born only yesterday and know nothing, and our days on earth are but a shadow." Bildad asks Job to look back toward these reliable historical sources to find his answer to his problems. He beseeches Job, look at your ancestors, right? Our ancestors, and learn from them. We have these wonderful examples from the past, and we should be finding out from them and learning what they've already learned. And Bildad shows quite the humility here, because he acknowledges that his accumulated knowledge is worth nothing, as if he were just born yesterday. Unfortunately for Bildad, we know that his assumptions about God were wrong, and now we also see that his application of the past is also wrong. He has this really good methodology, which is looking at past examples, but he hasn't done it quite right. I wish we could invite him here to learn about what it was that he wanted Job to observe. Because while the Bible is full of examples where the righteous are blessed and the the wicked are punished, it's not always this simple, right? The Bible is full of examples where life is not binary. It's not as simple as 1 and 0, black or white. We see many instances where things are straightforward, but we also see situations where faithful people faced negative results. Take the story of Cain and Abel. Abel was favored by God, but he was murdered in cold blood by Cain. Was that the reward Bildad was thinking about? Bildad's desire to learn from the past is admirable, and this is something we should all take to heart. But we have to be very careful, because Bildad misunderstood the lessons from the past, which resulted in an incorrect understanding of the God that he follows. So in chapters 9 and 10, Job responds to Bildad, and remembering Job's friend's understanding of how God functions, right? God is just, he runs the world according to his justice, and therefore Job must have sinned. And Job too has a very similar understanding of God, and it's an issue that continues to stumble him for most of the book. Only until the end does God speak and correct all of them on their wrong assumptions. And just like his friends, Job believes that God is just and that God should run the world according to justice. However, Job sees himself as innocent, and this causes a conflict between how he believes God should behave versus what he thinks is happening. And this results in him having two main conclusions, either that God doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is unjust. In Job chapter 9, verse 4 and 6, his wisdom is profound, his power is vast. Who has resisted him and come out unscathed? He moves mountains without them knowing it and overturns them in anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. Over the following verses, Job continues to talk about God. He continues to acknowledge the mighty power of God and gives different examples of it. But there's a small thing about it, is that while he talks about how powerful God is, he doesn't talk about how powerful God is for Job. The God that he gradually describes slowly, more and more feels distant and indifferent to Job. In verses 11 and 12, Job says, "When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. When he snatches away, who can stop him? Who can say to him, 'What are you doing?'" Job further expounds on this in verse 22 of chapter 9. God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. Job is saying that God doesn't differentiate between the good and the bad. His words imply that God actively brings suffering to both. By his understanding, God should be using his power to bless the righteous and harm the wicked, but that's not what he sees as happening. Job's second conclusion, which is that God himself is unjust. When a scourge brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. When a land falls into the hands of the wicked, he blindfolds its judges. Job here is basically accusing God for causing injustice on purpose. He even says that God mocks the suffering of the innocent, and he accuses God of contributing to corruption His main point, these are just analogies, but his main point here is this, that there's injustice in the land and God is causing it. At the end of verse 24, Job asks, if it is not he, then who is it? If it is not God causing the injustice, then who is it? Who is? And this is so interesting because even though he asked the question, he doesn't try to answer it beyond saying that it's God. Doesn't think of other options, right? Job is correct to assume that both good and evil suffer in life. But what he doesn't understand that in this case, the source of the suffering is from Satan, not God. He goes on to question God if he were human. Does it please you to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands while you smile on the plans of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a strong man? Because in Job's mind, God cannot partake in evil, which he's right. But because Job knows that he is innocent, this situation confuses him. He takes what he believes that God is wrongfully doing to him and compares it to the wickedness of man. In verses 8 and 9 of chapter 10, he says, your hand shaped me and made me. Will you now turn and destroy me? Remember that you molded me like clay. Will you now turn me to dust again? Job does a terrible thing here by attributing all of this, attributing unjust behavior to God, claiming that God is unjust. We know that when we are in our weakest moments, God gives us the grace to be strong. But it is also when we are in our weakest moments that doubt can seep in to cause us to step a little away from God, just as it happened here to Job. In the second point for Job's response, we see his desire for a mediator. Job acknowledges Bildad's final point, which is that God does not reject one who is blameless or strengthen the hands of evildoers. Job says, indeed, I know this is true. But how can mere mortals prove their innocence before God? Though they wish to dispute him, they could not answer him one time out of 1,000. Right? Job rightfully recognizes his innocence, just as God recognized him to be blameless and upright in chapter 1. But he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that yet. And at this point, he's agreeing with Bildad that God is taking action against him. So he wishes to prove his innocence. But notice his choice of words here. Though they wish to dispute with him. He wishes to dispute with God. And the Greek word for dispute can also mean contend or fight. So God is no longer someone on his side, but it is someone that Job needs to contend against. Not someone who is our providence, but someone that Job needs to fight with for survival. Job continues to utter pretty horrible words against the Almighty. Fortunately, at the end of the book of Job, he recognizes that he said some things that he didn't really understand, and he repents of what he said against God at that point. But as of right now, he's at the stage where he feels he cannot make sense of things. Because of the power and majesty of the Almighty, he feels this distance that he cannot breach. He feels a disparity in wisdom, which will make everything that he says to be worthless. Just like how you can get into an argument with someone who's more of an expert on a topic than you are, and it can be really hard to prove your point, right? To get your point across. And sometimes you walk away feeling a little foolish. And that's probably how Job feels. Right? There's no real way that I can get into this discussion with God. In his own words, God is not a mere mortal like me that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. So Job feels that the only way now that he can cope with the situation is that if there was a mediator. But there isn't, which is something that makes his uncertainty and suffering exacerbated. And as we go along in the text, it's very important that we maintain a high level of sensitivity to the plight of Job. It's very easy to look at Job and see a guy who's saying all these wrong things right now. But remember, this is a man who is at the deepest ends of his suffering. He's broken. He lost everything. He lost his flocks, his servants, his children, his health. He tried so hard to be faithful and upright, but now he feels punished. Even worse, his whole understanding of God is broken. And so his request for a mediator is understandable. And this is something we can all appreciate because this distance between God and us is not something that we need to deal with. Because when we want to approach God, we don't have to fear his power and his holiness like Job is doing at this stage. Because unlike Job, we have been blessed to live under the new covenant. Jesus Christ bridged that distance. He is our mediator. And additionally, we also have the Bible and the story of Job to learn more about God and build our understanding of God. The final thing that we can observe from these 3 chapters is Job's expression of his suffering. Job takes chapter 10 to cry out to God. We're not going to read too deeply into it, but let's take some time to appreciate his words. Perhaps some of us sitting here today can also relate to his cries to God. Remember, this is a dying man whose physical and mental strength has hit the bottom. He's sitting in ruins with everything he owned destroyed. He has been deserted by everyone, even by the friends who came to visit him, and even by God, who has been silent this whole time and will continue to be so for the many chapters to come. Job's tank is empty. He wants to prove his innocence, but he can't. He wants a mediator, but there's none. And with nothing left, he makes this complaint to God. So he cries, I loathe my life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. For the rest of the chapter, he continues in this downward spiral. Tell me, God, what do you have against me? Why am I being punished even though I have done no wrong? Are you wicked and unjust as mere mortals are? Are you actually happy to see me suffer? You built me up, so why are you destroying me? Whether I am guilty or innocent, it makes no difference because you are convinced to bring judgment on me. I wish I was never born. Anyway, I will be dead soon and I'll disappear into the darkness. But God, turn away from me so that I may have one moment's joy. Before we end for today, I'd like to bring up two observations that I really enjoy about the text that we've read. There's actually an amazing thing that Job did during these 3 chapters and also in the rest of the book. Remember how when he started to respond to Bildad, he began talking up God, talking about how powerful God is, how mighty he is. Yet his words don't seem like the usual kind of praise that you might see in David's Psalms. David, whether he was in joy or suffering, his words always showed a deep trust and understanding in God. Excuse me. And that's why he's described as a man after God's own heart. On the other hand, Job is in constant doubt. He's deep in his bitterness, and there's just so much uncertainty as he speaks and he prays, right, to God or talks to his friends. But sometimes you can't compare yourself with the model student. In this case, that's David. It's sometimes it can be annoying, right? When your parents ask you, look at your friends, why are they getting A's? Why are you not getting A's? Yeah, comparisons. Right? Yeah, I'm just using David here to contrast, to show some contrast between the two prayers or between the types of words that they use. I'm not actually trying to say that Job didn't do as great a job as David did, even though that seems to be the case. I actually think that Job did do some good things here. You see how Job stayed put, no matter how disappointed he was with God, no matter how unfair or even unjust he felt God was. Job never left the conversation. When his wife told him to curse God and die, Job did not. He never rejected God. And that is something very important in our relationship with God. Job did not leave. Instead, he stayed. He painted this picture of a powerful God, which showed that he did not forget who the Almighty was. He spoke about how distant and aloof God was, which showed how much Job yearned to be closer. When he cried for a mediator because he could not reason with God by himself, it showed how much Job yearned to be restored to God. In chapter 10, verse 2, he says, "Do not condemn me. Show me why you contend with me." He's constantly interested in what God has to say. So when everything seems to come to the worst possible end and you feel so disappointed in God, do not leave. It's the same with relationships, right? As a husband and wife or as a parent and child, when the argument gets so bad, don't leave. Unless, of course, you need to leave the presence of each other for a short period of time to give each other some space. But when you're both breathing normally again, you want to get back into that same space to talk it out, to air your hurts, to mend what was broken. And it's the same thing with God. When we don't think, same thing with our relationship with God. When we don't think we can understand what is going on and the pain is unbearable, do not leave. Job wanted to stay. He wanted to mend, and eventually his relationship with God was restored. It could be today, or it could be a day in the future that we feel that same distance with God, possibly disappointment. Don't leave. Stay and take the time to work it out with God and grow in your understanding of the Almighty. Yearn to be restored. Today, when we study scripture and the story of Job, it provides us with this, with consolation and hope in our grief. A pain that Job could not understand a loss that made no sense to him. Suffering without cause. A very powerful word that we can use to describe Job's situation is powerlessness. Notice how many times and how many ways Job describes his powerlessness in the text today. And that's not even looking at the rest of the book. How mighty and high up was he before his suffering that the people around him attributed his wealth to his faithfulness. Riches and status made him a very powerful man, and perhaps it made him feel really secure. He felt that things were as they should be. For he too agreed that righteousness should lead to earthly blessings. Yet how low did he fall from having everything to having less than nothing? How he was in control and then he had no control. How he had power over his life and then he was powerless. In Singapore today, especially with the modern day approach to careers, we often feel powerful when we have wealth, jobs, and education. We're able to access things or do things that might not have been previously possible. And as we climb this ladder of wealth and knowledge, we feel more and more empowered to do things for ourselves, our friends, and our family. We enjoy that control, as little as it may be, and then subconsciously we think that we have power over our lives. But look at Job. When God wants to take it away, it just disappears. So maybe that is what we need to focus on sometimes, our powerlessness. When we remember the fleeting nature of what we have, we lose that misleading sense of control. We feel more fear about losing what we have, and this is realistic with those who have had their jobs threatened by the COVID situation. Yet acknowledging this powerlessness will help us to look toward God for solutions, for His will. We start to recognize that He is the true source of power and that all things revolve around Him and not us. In our powerlessness, we are able to rely on His power, rely on His power to save our souls. We rely on His power to change us. We rely on His power to provide for us. We rely on His power when we bless those around us. We rely on His power when we wake up in the morning and go to work or school. When we are able to fully rely on Him for each and everything in our lives, even when bad things happen, He will take away our cares and worries, and our burdens will become His burdens. So that's all for today. Thank you all for tuning in to Bible class this morning. I hope you have a great week ahead and stay safe and stay fit.